Thank you, Madam President. As I travel across Montana, I hear from folks who work tirelessly every day to make ends meet. Many work long hours for too low of wages, and they face ever-rising costs in housing and health care and other basic necessities. But you know, folks in Montana are resilient and they're resourceful, and they know how to live within their means, and they know how important it is to make the numbers add up at the end of the month. I rise today because, as usual, Washington, D.C. could learn a lot from Montana. This week, we will vote on a bill that swipes Washington's credit card to the tune of about $250 billion over the next 2 years. Dollars that will come out of the pockets of our kids and our grandkids. Now, this $250 billion comes on top of the $1 trillion the United States will add to the national deficit this year because our budget is that far out of whack. Previous year to this year was $800 billion that we added to the national debt. So to put that in perspective, that's about $2.2 trillion in just 2 years. And if you're sitting at home wondering, $2.2 trillion, how much is that? Well, it's far more than $250 billion. And with $250 billion, half the students going to college for 4 years would not have to pay anything to go to school in the United States. And we're adding $2.2 trillion. And it's going to continue on until we get our budget in line. And fortunately, this sort of reckless spending by both parties has shown a disregard for its impact on the national debt, and it is now the norm in Washington, D.C. Folks on both sides of the aisle are calling for this agreement, and they're calling it a compromise. But in reality, the only thing it'll compromise is our children and our grandchildren's future. Montanans expect me to hold Washington, D.C. accountable and fight back against irresponsible spending and poor tax policy. This falls on the irresponsible spending side. The Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget projects that this administration's policies will add $4 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. I am here to tell you that that is too conservative as a figure. At this point in time, we're going to be adding about $1.2 trillion to the debt every year if things don't change. Our debt is skyrocketing. And guess what? We're not fixing the health care problems that need to be fixed. We're not fixing the high cost of education. We're not investing in our infrastructure. But our debt continues to skyrocket because of irresponsible spending and, quite frankly, a Republican tax giveaway for the wealthy at the expense of our kids and our grandkids. You know, I've listened to colleagues on both sides of the aisle during my tenure here that warned of debt and how our national debt could damage our economy and our national security. 2 years ago, my Republican colleagues passed a partisan tax giveaway drafted behind closed doors with no public input from Montanans or anyone else in this country. They promised that this tax giveaway would pay for itself, but it did not. Let me say that one more time. They promised the tax giveaway would pay for itself, but guess what? Just like the previous ones, it didn't. Instead, it tacked about $2 trillion onto our national debt. And it is another example of why we can't get our books in order, because we have a short-sighted fiscal approach that makes us the first generation to inherit from our parents and borrow from our kids. My colleagues made campaign promises to tackle this debt. As a congressman, Mick Mulvaney, who happens to be the President's Chief of Staff, pledged to eliminate it. But this White House has done just the opposite. As we stand here today, the debt has exploded to more than $22 trillion. And it continues to climb higher every day, despite the country being in the middle of the longest period of economic expansion of our history. Now, I'm going to tell you, it is one thing to run a deficit when you were in a recession. It's necessary to bring the economy back. But when you are in the longest period of economic expansion in this country's history, we should be paying that debt down, and we are not. We are adding to it as if we were in a recession. And running trillion-dollar deficits during times of growth like this one, and everybody in this body knows it, puts the economy on a sugar high. It feels good now, but we all know it's not sustainable, and a crash is inevitable. The same folks who voted to pile on $2 trillion onto the deficit now argue, some of them, that we cannot find the money to provide our veterans with the health care they've earned. They say we need deep cuts into Medicaid and Social Security and other programs that many folks have paid into for their entire life, but yet we're going to cut them. No, I've known, and we all know, that budgets and spending is about priorities, and it is clear that Congress's priorities are out of whack. You wouldn't know it from watching C-SPAN, but it is possible to be fiscally conservative without cutting working folks off the knees. I know this because as President of the Montana Senate, I negotiated and passed a balanced budget because the state constitution requires it. Since coming to the U.S. Senate, I've led a push to add a constitutional amendment requiring Congress pass a balanced budget. Now, look, we all know it can't be done overnight, but in a measured approach, with bipartisan cooperation, we can at least get headed in the right direction. There is no reason why we cannot make smart investments in working families, our kids' education, 21st century infrastructure, and the other needs across this country without bankrupting future generations. Folks in the Treasure State know that, and Washington, D.C. needs to know that too. It is time for Congress to follow Montana's lead. Madam President, I yield the floor.